What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Shawn Arent. Dr. Arent, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. I'm super excited to get into our conversation today, which is centered around a recent paper of yours titled Nutrient Timing, a Garage Door of Opportunity. But before we get into the weeds here, can you provide our listeners with a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I'm currently a professor and chair of exercise science at the University of South Carolina. We are the top-ranked exercise science program in the U.S., and actually it'll be a full decade that we'll be in that role. So we just got the rankings just came out a couple months ago, and that's good for the next 5 years, and we were the existing #1 program. I'm director of the Sport Science Lab here at the University of South Carolina Sport Science Lab. Prior to this, I was at Rutgers for 17 years, and we started the Center for Health and Human Performance there. We're able to accomplish some tremendous things. I was fortunate to have a great group around me in the center, and many of them actually came with me when I came down to South Carolina. So I've been in South Carolina since, pre-COVID, but it was the August prior to this one. So I've been here a little over about a year and a half. Fantastic opportunities here. We do a lot of work in exercise and stress. And so looking at the stress response, looking at exercise and training as a stressor, and then ways to buffer stress as well. So looking at nutritional interventions, different modalities of training, recovery considerations, and stuff like that. I was fortunate to have been an athlete through college, and we've kind of carried that over. We work a lot with some pretty darn good sports here at the University of South Carolina, but certainly when we were at Rutgers, we worked really closely with Rutgers women's soccer, and some of what we'll touch on today will come from some of the lessons we learned through that research as well. But yeah, at this point, it's, we're fortunate to do what we do. I love this field. We're lucky to be in the environment we are down here, and I'm just coming off. I'm the immediate past president of the International Society of Sports Nutrition.
Excellent. I thought you had a history at Rutgers. I remember few years back now, but when I was applying to different colleges for my undergraduate degree in nutrition, I'm from the Philadelphia area, and when I was looking into universities around, Rutgers was towards the top of my list specifically because I think I heard you on the Iraqi nutrition podcast.
Oh, with Juma, yeah.
Yeah. So Rutgers was up there, and then I saw you ended up transitioning a little bit later down the road. But very cool, Dr. Arent, to open up this discussion. And I think this was the #1 thing about your review paper that I enjoyed, and that was this discussion about the anabolic window. And that's because in our evidence-based fitness realm, it seems that we get really attached to certain papers, to certain research, and we kind of forget about everything else. And when the original Schoenfeld and Aragon paper came out, everyone just kind of looked at the results of that and went, okay, anabolic window doesn't matter. We don't have to talk about it ever again.
Right.
And I think that was extremely unfortunate. And you provided a really unique perspective, a different way to look at the anabolic window and why it truly is relevant, especially when it comes to sports nutrition. When we're talking about the anabolic window, this is commonly perceived as this we're primed for nutrients during this period of time. Can you tell our audience what exactly is going on physiologically that would substantiate that perception?
Sure. So, I think it's important to back up a little bit and recognize that when we talk about this idea of nutrient timing and sort of this precise delivery of nutrients at strategic times, and there's a good history of this, and we've seen this throughout, especially on the athlete side. And I think that a little bit of confuse this area is there's a noticeable difference between sport nutrition or performance nutrition and physique nutrition. And I think what often happens in the physique nutrition is, what's the least I have to do, right? Do I really have to do that? If I'm dealing with a high level athlete, they're going, what 1 or 2% can I do that will make me that much better, right? So there's a different mentality that goes into that. And in all fairness, with what Alan and Brad looked at, they were really looking at protein timing. Okay, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. We're talking about nutrient timing, which goes beyond just protein. Now, that being said, here's what's happened. So you've just completed an exercise bout, or let's say you're going to do one, all right? Because the anabolic window was really reserved for post-exercise timing. But we now know from a timing standpoint, it matters throughout the day, right? It matters pre, during, post, your next meal, your sleep, all these things kind of come together. So we time our day so that the timing aspect makes sense. You're not just going to eat one big bolus meal. It's not going to get you where you want to be. But that being said, let's say we really frame it around that post-workout period. All right, you've done a few things. First of all, you've stimulated a number of different mechanisms in the body that prime you for adaptation. All right, so we have muscle breakdown and we have the need for recovery now. And so in that period of time, especially with, say, resistance training, your body is primed to want to repair. And it will find that from somewhere, even if it has to come from internal sources. It's trying to make these adaptations. You don't want to strip your internal sources. You'd rather provide something extra. The other thing that's happening too is you realize that, especially from a carbohydrate uptake standpoint, your GLUT4 transporters, all right, which are responsible for glucose uptake into the cell, into the muscle cell, they're insulin independent transporters. But what happens is insulin will stimulate them, but so does physical activity. And so what winds up happening is our insulin dependent transporters. What happens is with physical activity, that also creates this sort of uptick in GLUT4 activation, and then we move those to the cell surface. What that means is in that period of time following exercise, if you take in carbohydrate, those GLUT4 transporters are really primed to bring that carbohydrate into the muscle cell. Now you can store it as glycogen, you're replenishing your stores, now you've got what you need for your next workout, especially if it's high intensity. The other thing too is when you eat that carbohydrate, insulin now goes up. So what you're doing is you're kind of getting a double whammy when it comes to those GLUT4 transporters and really making them that much more effective in order to do this. Now, people would argue, if you're not fully depleting glycogen, does that matter? Sure, just from a timing standpoint. I think the thing that is useful to keep in mind as we talk about all this is try to create a scenario in your head where timing would be a bad thing. You're going to have a hard time doing that. All right, it's not a bad thing, right? So it's like there's a difference between, can we and should we? And I think that's important. But also, when would it be a bad idea to eat after you work out, right? And so I think sometimes the practicality is lost in that. But again, we'll come back to that a little bit when we talk about that anabolic window versus garage door mentality.
Yeah, you mentioned garage door there, and for the listeners who are familiar with this research, and perhaps we've already alluded to your answer to this question based on the title of this paper, but roughly how long are we talking when it comes to the anabolic window, this physiological state we're primed for the uptake of nutrients and to replenish glycogen? How long do we have here?
From the glycogen replenishment standpoint, the sort of the big upside period is going to be a little bit shorter. You might be talking for 30 to 60 minutes post, maybe a little bit longer. But again, you're trying to take advantage of those GLUT4 transporters. In the absence of food intake, they're going to relocate back to the cellular interior. From a protein standpoint, or from a repair standpoint, when is the muscle itself primed to sort of regenerate? Hours. It could be hours, especially depending on the intensity of it, the degree of stimulus and stuff like that. That's what's been used to argue against this anabolic window. Oh, it's ridiculous. Like, you don't have to eat right after. You actually have these hours post where you have this window of to do this. And that's where I struggled with the way the message was coming across, because you can either look at that as you've got hours to do this, so it really doesn't matter if you eat right away. Or you can look at it from the standpoint of you've got hours, so if you eat right away, you now have more time to do it again and take advantage of that larger window. And so I think what it's come down to is, rather than looking at it as this anabolic window, which we kind of think of as this smaller finite period of time, it's more like a garage door. Like you have a lot more time in there, but that also means more opportunities to fit these nutrients in, rather than going, oh, I might as well wait, right? And I think where part of the rationale for why we wrote this particular paper is when I started to see some of the messaging that was revolving on from the physique standpoint of you don't have to eat protein right away. Even if you were to get it an hour or two later, there's still a benefit to it. I started seeing strength coaches go, I knew it was a waste. Now I tell my athletes not to eat after exercise. No, that's not what the message was there. And so I think that got lost, unfortunately. It got really kind of blown out of proportion in terms of what the findings really were. And I think that the reality too is looking at that research and understanding who the subjects often were in these studies, and was it really nutrient timing research included? And I think that's where the area started to get very cloudy. And the rationale for why timing actually can very much matter, especially if performance is a big consideration. And when we start to look at carbohydrate timing, hell, even creatine timing, there's some evidence that whether you take pre or post makes a bit, not a huge, but a bit of a difference in terms of absorption. And again, taking advantage of opportunities from a feeding standpoint. I really think that there's some cool research by Stu Phillips and his group where they had even shown with varying amounts of protein, certainly if you waited a longer period of time after exercise, even with a larger bolus feeding, you didn't induce the same muscle protein synthesis as if you had eaten closer to the training. So there is evidence that it matters. The question becomes, how much does it matter? And do you need to get super caught up in the, oh my God, I didn't have my protein shake within 2 minutes of finishing my workout, all my gains are gone, it's a waste. No, you don't have to freak out about it. But at the same time, if we're eating throughout the day and you're fueling athletes, and especially if they have multiple training sessions, you do need to eat as close to possible after training in order to fit all your meals in, if nothing else.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And you brought up there the physique community, which is ultimately why I thought it was so important to have this conversation today to highlight this point. But the fact that you also mentioned that you ran into a few strength coaches who also, had this pessimistic view of this research and telling their athletes not to eat after that, that's mind blowing to me. And it makes our conversation even more important because while a large portion of the audience is physique athletes, I also know that there are a handful of performance coaches, strength coaches, sports nutritionists as well.
Sure. Yep. And I think that's, again, regardless of, it's interesting in the physique world too, because sometimes we lose sight of the performance aspect, and it's very much just like, what'll get me to the lowest body fat? Well, here's the thing, even from that standpoint, with muscle growth and losing body fat, there's still evidence for timing. Sorry, totally off topic. Well, not completely, because it's a timing issue. There's even evidence that the order you eat food within a meal impacts how it's metabolized. So please tell me nutrient timing doesn't matter. Even within a single meal, that can make a difference. Now, a big difference? No, we lose the forest for the trees at that point, right? If people are like, you can time the crap out of your protein, for example, but if you don't eat enough in a day, you've missed the cake, right? You got to bake the cake first before you put the frosting and the icing and all that crap on it. So take care of the big things first, but then the littler things start to matter. And I think that is really the important message, even in the physique world, is it still comes down to your training and your overall diet and your sleep. But outside of that, then how you structure exercises within your training and how you eat before, during, or after your training. Now it starts to matter a bit more.
Absolutely. Touching specifically on the Schoenfeld paper, we already mentioned how in this conversation about nutrient timing, it was a little more specific in that it was on protein rather than nutrient timing as a whole. And that's, I think, one issue or misconception that some people might have about this topic is that they might have heard about the paper, never really read it, and just assume nutrient timing as a whole, and that's not the point. But there are some other nuances of this paper that we should probably be looking at to really understand the full picture of the results and what was actually getting across from it. Can you elaborate on some of those details?
Sure. And again, from a summary standpoint, there's nothing wrong with the paper. I think, Brad and Alan, I think, did a really nice job with it. But when you look then more specifically at the studies on which we're basing our conclusions, realize that only 4 of the 30 plus studies actually use trained individuals, right? And at the end of the day, when it comes down to a trained or untrained individual, in an untrained individual, the training stimulus is going to carry the biggest load in all of that, and really your overall protein intake. And so what happened was the conclusion was basically the timing of the protein didn't matter so much. It was the overall protein intake. Absolutely. I just said that. If you can time the crap out of it, but if you don't eat enough in a day, that's a problem. What it wasn't able to parse out because of the nature of the studies, realized that only really 2 or 3 of those studies were what we would consider nutrient timing studies, where they specifically manipulated and compared when different nutrients were administered. And of the two main ones, it was the Cribb and Hayes study and the Hoffman et al. Study. One found it mattered, one it didn't. But the interesting thing is in the Cribb and Hayes study where they found it mattered, whether they fed before and after a workout versus the same macronutrient composition earlier in the day and before bed, the timing around the workout made a bigger difference. But they also fed carbohydrate. Interestingly, in the Hoffman study, it was pretty much just protein. There was very little carbohydrate given. Back to my point about nutrient timing, not just protein timing, right? So is there a synergistic effect and what advantages are there in this and sort of looking at the training? So, and again, it's not to say that nutrient timing doesn't matter at all for a relatively novice individual. It's just not going to matter a lot unless you're doing all the other things right. You know, it's like train hard, eat enough, here we go. As you get farther along and you're looking for those little things to optimize the outcomes, now the timing starts to matter more once you've taken care of the bigger picture items, right? So it's not, it was almost presented, I don't think so much by Brad and Alan as it was by people reading the study or trying to interpret it. It was almost presented as an either or. It's a both. You can eat enough protein and time it. It doesn't mean that you just do one or the other. And I think that was the part that got lost in this a little bit. And if nothing else, it helps shed light on sort of the duration of that garage door. You know, how long can this last? But again, my argument would be if I have an anabolic response for that longer period of time, why not take advantage of it rather than dismissing and going, I don't have to eat right now. I've got a couple hours. Sure, you could have fit another meal in there too.
It all comes down to perspective, right? While most people are
Yes.
going, bad news, guys, anabolic window is way longer than you thought. Doesn't matter. It's, hey guys, this is great news. Get some more meals in.
That's exactly it. And it's interesting how sort of how it went that direction is instead of looking at it as an opportunity, it was an excuse. And I don't really think that's the best way to look at it.
Yeah, definitely not. I know the listeners are going to appreciate this because I think largely what sets us apart from other podcasts in this industry when it comes to this strength and physique evidence-based community is that I think a lot of people want to simplify this or dumb it down and say, well, these things don't matter. We already touched on this is the icing on the cake. So a lot of people will see icing on the cake. Well, then who cares? You know, why waste the extra effort? But if you're already training 5 days per week, if you're already eating 200 grams plus of protein per day and having why not go for the extra couple of percent? And I think some people, because of that, are almost scared to have entire conversations about a topic that can only gain you 1%. But I know our listeners who come to this and enjoy these episodes really appreciate these nuances. And this brings us into our next topic of nutrient timing, which is mostly going to be in regard to carbohydrate. This is something that I think is perhaps slightly controversial within the physique community specifically. And just to get this going, I think it's a good idea to lay out how much glycogen are we depleting with a traditional resistance exercise session? Because that's something you commonly hear, right? Like carbohydrates, glycogen depletion. It's not a big deal because when it comes to resistance exercise, you're not depleting much of it. But these studies are different in terms of how many sets are being utilized, the intensity of effort. And for these reasons, I would like to propose a more specific question at you. And that's when we look at a typical hard bodybuilding style training session, we're probably talking somewhere in the realm of 10 to 12 hard working sets. Approximately how much glycogen depletion are we looking at?
Yeah, so if you're talking, let's say, for example, we train roughly 45 minutes to an hour, right? And like you said, it's maybe slightly shorter rest intervals, higher volume and stuff like that. You're probably looking at maybe 50 to 60% glycogen depletion, which now, let's put this into context, though. So there's some really great work by Bengt Saltine dating back to the 1970s in soccer. And what they found is in soccer players, you saw upwards of 95% glycogen depletion in a 90-minute match, right? So they're going to need carbohydrate. Now, let's take that back on the physique side, the lifting side. Okay, maybe it's 50 or 60%. Now, there was a bit of misinterpretation early on by some where they said, okay, for the listeners that aren't familiar with what a Wingate test is, The Wingate test is a bike test. And what I'll do is I'll have you start pedaling as fast as you can and drop about 10% of your body weight on the flywheel. And you do that for 30 seconds. Doesn't sound awful. It's actually 30 seconds of hell. All right. Now, the idea is that initial Wingate test is glycogen depleting. It might deplete upwards of 15 to 20% glycogen. So the thought is, okay, if that's the case and I string a few of these together, I'm going to get to 100% glycogen depletion. Here's the catch. That plateaus. It's not the same rate after every interval because you start to adjust in terms of fuel utilization, right, as well as work output. So you don't necessarily, within 4 working sets of a Wingate, you don't necessarily get to 80% glycogen depletion. So that's an important background on this. So we might say, okay, 95% depletion in a soccer match, and we're only looking at like 50% with a really hard weight training workout. Glycogen doesn't matter. Not so fast. Even 50% is a notable enough amount that can impact your overall work ability when you're looking at load tolerance. And the other thing too is, I like to think that one of the things that we're pretty good about in sport nutrition is planning for the next session. I think we're horrible about that in physique nutrition. We're very much about, what do I need right now? And you're not thinking ahead to, am I training again tomorrow? And the day after, and the day after, am I doing multiple sessions? What am I doing? Am I doing some Metcon work? You know, all that kind of stuff that goes into it. And I think if we take that mentality and go, what can you do to facilitate recovery as much as possible so you're ready to roll the next day? And I think that's where really kind of looking at that with the glycogen aspect becomes useful. So yeah, let's say for sake of argument, 50 to 60% glycogen depletion in a hard training workout to kind of set the stage for where you're going next.
No, I love that. And you touched on my next question for this, and it's that at what percent of glycogen depletion do we start to see decrements in performance? Because the way people talk about this is if, like, as long as there's some there, you're perfectly fine. There's not going to be any drop off in performance. It's like, why would this matter if a session only depletes 50%? You don't even have to eat carbs post training for the rest of the day. And then you can head into tomorrow and you'll have like 50% there. No biggie. It doesn't matter. But at what percent of depletion do we start to see some of these performance decrements?
So it's hard to put a number on that because it depends on what your performance is and when you're going to need carbohydrate. So realize that much of your high intensity work is influenced by what you have endogenously that you're already storing, not by what you take in during. Some degree you can help with that. Sure, if we take in carbohydrate during, if you're in a reduced glycogen phase. But overall, you're potentially impeding workout. So it depends on what our metric is for performance. If we're talking torque, if we're talking anaerobic power, if we're looking at sustainability over 20, 30 seconds, something like that, can start to matter a lot more, especially if you're doing interval type work and things. The other thing too that's forgotten a lot in this is even if, let's say for the sake of argument, 50%, it doesn't have a big performance impact. Here's the catch though, it does have an immune impact. And so one of the things that's often forgotten about carbohydrate intake is carbohydrate intake post-exercise actually helps with recovery of the immune system along with protein intake because of the enzymatic function and the fact that so much of your immune system is based on protein. But we know that actually helps with recovery because of what it does to get some of your stress-related hormones under control. Realize your immune system with high-intensity exercise is acutely disrupted, right? Because it's in a repair mechanism phase. It's not in a protection phase. So the immune system has to recover as well. And so carbohydrate helps with that. And I think with everything we're dealing with worldwide right now, it's a perfect time to talk about that immune function and the fact that, sometimes we're so worried about, did it make my biceps a little bigger? Did it help? Did I gain 5 pounds on my bench? We're forgetting about the other things. The one thing I love to kind of focus on is like when we're dealing with athletes, the best ability of an athlete is availability, right? So if you're not getting sick and you're not breaking down, you can train more. You recover, you progress more. And I think that's part of what we have to keep in the context of this as well.
Absolutely. This is slightly off topic, but you did mention in the past question that physique athletes seem to be pretty bad at, considering how their nutrition right now affects their performance, tomorrow,
Sure.
later in the week. And that brings to my mind is that it's common for athletes to reduce their calorie intake, sometimes substantially on a rest day.
Yeah.
Their idea is that I'm not training, so I don't need as many calories. Whereas I think your opinion on that might be a little bit different in that, this is a time to recover. It might not be a good idea to reduce that energy intake, especially if you're training on the day after your rest day, and potentially that could compromise performance there. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. What are your thoughts on reducing energy intake on rest days?
Depends on your goals, right?
Okay.
So if you're trying to, again, in the physique world, if you're trying to cut body fat and you need to bring your calories down at certain times in order to impact this, then that might be one of your prime opportunities. I would argue then that the timing aspect becomes even more critical. So in other words, after your previous workout or with your timing out throughout that day, having sort of these spaced protein meals, paying attention to when to take advantage of carbohydrate uptake rather than storage, all those are really, really good, rather than fat storage. Those are good things to pay attention to. On the other hand, if I'm working with an athlete in season, and I'm going to use soccer as an example, because in the NCAA, let's say I'm working on the women's side, they would typically play a Friday, Sunday match schedule. All right. So Saturday would kind of be a bit of an off day. Monday might be an off day before we launch into week. Actually, Mondays we often lifted instead. I would argue then that given what we're looking at in the course of that season, and I go, oh, you played a match on Friday, you play again on Sunday, eat less on Saturday because that's a recovery day. No. That would be a prime day to go refuel because we need you for Sunday. We got to turn this around. And realize too that working with female athletes, it actually takes them longer to carbohydrate load. So there's some evidence, because we might say, oh, you know what? Within a 24-hour span, if you eat, 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, it's more than enough to replenish all of it. You don't have to do it right after. There's actually evidence using soccer data, and like I said, 95% glycogen depletion, that it can take them in excess of 3 full days to get back to baseline levels of glycogen. So now, would we say the same thing with a hard weight training session where maybe we see 50, maybe 60% depletion? No, you could replace that in a 24-hour stretch, but you got to be smart about it too, and depending on what you're trying to do. And I think one of the areas that I find really intriguing with carbohydrate timing is the work that we've seen on carb-restricted training, right? So like James E. Morton and his group have done quite a bit with this in the performance realm, especially with cycling, where you would do a high-intensity session, say that evening. You wouldn't eat carbohydrate after, you'd fuel with protein, and then you would perform a session in the morning on low carbohydrate stores. So you wouldn't feed carbohydrate during that. Couple things to keep in mind. First of all, people went, see, fasted cardio works. Here's the funny part. While that restricted training actually did help with mitochondrial biogenesis, so like your aerobic capacity and stuff, it didn't actually result in performance benefits unless they fed protein with that training. In other words, it wasn't fasted training, it was carb restricted training. The other thing too, it was typically cycling or running, and it was not done every day. This was usually maybe 3, maybe 4 days a week where they would engage in that. And then they would feed carbohydrate right after that though, right? So now you replenish so you can do your high intensity session, because those were typically lower intensity sessions. If I'm working with an athlete that requires contact, agility, cutting and stuff like that, training in a carb restricted state may not be very smart because of the injury potential. So what additional aerobic benefit would I get that really I'm more interested in the skill acquisition and the overall benefit there? On the physique side, right? Potentially if you feel like you want to train in a low carb state and you're not angry about it, go right ahead. I would still encourage you to feed protein. There's really no evidence that fasted cardio works any better than anything else. It's purely based on, oh, we burn more fat. Again, the timing aspect, though, in terms of taking in protein prior and getting these positive benefits, again, it still shows its head. It's just a question of how much in comparison to the other bigger issues. So, not that timing's a bad thing. It really can be a good thing. It's just not the big mover. There's still bigger parts you have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. On the topic of fasted cardio, we had Dr. Guillermo Escalante on to discuss this topic, and I proposed a very theoretical question at him, designing the study to kind of figure out which form of cardio would be the best for fat loss. And his hypothesis was actually that a form of protein-enhanced cardio would probably be the best for physique athletes compared to fasted, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with Guillermo on that. I think that, when you look at what the impact would be on sparing muscle, as well as, because the one thing that you don't want to do is if you perform in a fasted state, you're going to oxidize leucine, right? That's going to have to become a fuel source. And if you're providing protein as part of that, you're in some ways keeping that from occurring. Your best way of keeping it from occurring is with carbs. Because now you can use those for high intensity, but it also depends on the intensity you want to work at and stuff like that. But yeah, I think Guillermo's done some really cool work in this area, and he's spot on with sort of his take on it. And I probably don't have much to add to it, just because I know I see eye to eye with him on it. So yeah, sorry that's not more fun, but that's all I got.
Excellent. Let's get into peri-workout nutrition. We're on carbohydrates here. We've talked about the amount of glycogen depletion that typically occurs within a hard resistance exercise session. With that in mind, what should we be doing with our carbohydrate intake pre-workout? Is there a benefit to topping off glycogen stores pre-workout? Perhaps if we consider an athlete in the off season, their glycogen stores are pretty full all the time. I mean, they could probably not eat, and as long as they did a decent job fueling the day before, maybe they're at 80%. Do they have any benefit to making sure they're at 100 before the resistance exercise session?
Yeah, potentially. And I think if nothing else, we see, depending on the intensity of that session, even taking in some exogenous carbohydrate as part of your meal can help spare some of that muscle glycogen for a period of time. So you got a little more left there towards the end. Would it be as essential as, say, high carb meal or something before a soccer match or a football game or field hockey or a cycling race? No, not necessarily. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you don't want to eat carbohydrate. Maybe you just don't eat as much, right? So in other words, you don't need this giant bolus of carbohydrate to fuel that workout. Maybe you get away with a little bit less, but at the same time, if you're going to train with high intensity, there would be very little downside to that. And usually where I see people kind of try to wiggle out of that one a little bit is where they'll say, oh, but rebound hypoglycemia, right? So for those that don't know that are listening, rebound hypoglycemia is sort of a paradoxical effect. What happens is you take in carbohydrate, which should prevent hypoglycemia, right? Blood sugar drop. But it depends. In some people, if you take in that carbohydrate close to that workout, and then you start to exercise. Remember those GLUT4 transporters we talked about before? Well, they become active. What happens is blood glucose actually drops, right? So what happens is people become hypoglycemic. So people go, see, this is why you shouldn't eat carbs before a workout. Not so fast. Here's the catch, though. There's actually some really cool work that's actually shown that with about a 10 to 15 minute warm up, that becomes pretty much negated. So in other words, if you just do a warm up after that feeding, and not only that, but there seems to be a genetic susceptibility to this, only maybe 25 to 30% of the population that's been tested anyway, seems to be susceptible to this rebound hypoglycemic effect, and not everybody has a performance decrement because of it. But again, with a proper warm-up. So one solution to that, in addition to the warm-up, just eat that carb a little farther out, right? So either do one of two things, eat it farther out, like hour and a half, or really close in, like 5 to 10 minutes, because then by the time you're looking at the blood response and stuff, you've gone through the warm-up, and there you go. And I have actually worked with athletes that have a rebound hypoglycemia response, and it is something we paid attention to and just worked on the timing aspect with it.
I love that nuance. Do you have a general recommendation here for carbohydrate intake? I think if we look at the traditional sports nutrition recommendations from Burke, it's something in the area of 1 to 4 grams per kg, 1 to 4 hours before training, and that probably makes a ton of sense. We're looking at real sports like endurance events or mixed sports like football and soccer. But when it comes to resistance exercise, in my mind, it seems like slight overkill. What would your recommendations be?
Honestly, in that case, probably the low end of that 1 to 4, if you're looking at, 1 to 2 grams per kilogram. And even that for some might be pretty high. But if you're looking at, even if you were to look at almost like a 1-to-1 protein to carb mix or whatever, just, 40, 80, 100, 120 grams of carbohydrate, part of it depends on your size. Right. If you're working with a smaller athlete, a smaller physique individual who, might weigh, I don't know, 50, 60 kilos or something like that. If, especially if you're working with a female or something, and maybe they're on the lighter side, you're not going to need as much as you would with somebody that weighs 100 plus kilos. So I think it comes down to size is going to play an aspect. And that's why it's nice to make it as a relative gram per kilogram part. The problem you have, and you're well aware of this if you work around the physique world, is if you tell somebody eat 120 grams of carbohydrate, they look at you like you got 3 heads. Like, oh my God, I'm going to get so fat on that, right? So that's why there's a sales part to this as well in terms of them understanding what it's fueling. And you may not do that before every workout. And it also depends on the length of your workout and what you're doing with it. And I would argue if you're going to do more high intensity type interval work, if you're doing Metcon work or something like that, yeah, then a little more carbohydrate will probably go a long way. Otherwise, you can definitely get away with less if that's the case. And there's where your daily timing becomes an issue. And, having some before, some after, top off, you're good to go.
Great. In your paper, something I found really fascinating was the unique benefits of protein intake pre-exercise. I think for most people, they just see it as another opportunity to get a protein feeding in that'll contribute to their total daily intake, but there's probably some other benefits that aren't being considered commonly. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I would say, some of that is sort of a protein sparing effect, because overall protein balance is a function of synthesis and degradation, or synthesis and breakdown. So the ways you can impact that overall balance is increasing the synthesis or decreasing the breakdown or doing a little bit of both, right? So from that standpoint, there's some evidence that protein feeding before may positively impact breakdown in order to slow it down. Whether that's a good thing or not depends on what we want for adaptation and ultimate goals and things like that. But I think that there's an upside there. But overall, too, how that then influences responses post, and I think that's the important part is what I think is a little bit challenging is the way that's been interpreted is they'll compare a pre-feeding with a post-feeding, and they'll go, look, they were pretty much the same. Right. So in other words, it's sort of if you ate within this period of time, then, it didn't help. I look at it like this when I'm working with an athlete, especially if it's maybe like a 2+ hour training session. Again, maybe not in the weight room, but if we're doing other skill work or other work, nobody's really looked at pre and post compared to one or the other. And my thing is always, why not both? Right. Especially depending on what you're trying to fit in. Maybe you don't need as much on either side of that, but certainly there's a benefit to be had with timing around that training session. So, some of it comes down to personal preference. Some people do not like to eat before they work out, and especially depending on how close, it feels heavy in their stomach or whatever it is. But I know Arnie Ferrando has done some really cool work in military operators. They're doing some stuff with the Rangers. And they actually found that pre-training feedings under high intensity type stresses actually did have a very positive anabolic effect on the overall recovery. And it was, and the pre actually appeared to be even more impactful in females than it did in males when they were looking at military personnel. So, again, I think those are things to kind of keep in the back of your mind in terms of ways to optimize your adaptations. I'm not saying you have to do one or the other, whatever, but I think that there's, it's funny if you think about protein feeding throughout the day. And some would argue, by the way, I'm sure you've heard the whole, you can't use more than 20 grams at a time. Such crap, everybody. Please, for the love of God, don't listen to that. I don't know where that came from. A lot of it is focused around at what point do we maximize muscle protein synthesis. Now, when I say that, also realize there's more to protein utilization than just muscle protein synthesis. There's also whole body effects when we look at the immune system, enzyme function, neurotransmitters. There's other places this goes. Anyway, if we look at it, and let's say for the sake of argument, we go, okay, maybe you max out somewhere around 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal. And by the way, I'm really using that figure very loosely. This is just for the sake of illustration, right? Some people can do more than that. Some might hit a plateau before that. Depends on body size, depends on the workout. And now I say, okay, 30 to 40 grams, but I want you to take in, we'll make the math really easy, right? 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, gram per pound, since we're metrically challenged. So, and that's on the high end, right? So we go, okay, but let's say it's for the sake of argument. And I go, and let's say I've got a 100-kilogram athlete. Well, if I start to split that up into 40 gram doses of protein throughout the day, by simple math, I'm going to have at least 5 feedings of protein at 40 grams each in order to hit 200 grams of protein. If I don't eat before and after my training, I'm going to start to run out of opportunities to do that, right? So I actually look at the timing around training as just another part of your eating schedule. It's another opportunity to hit your overall caloric and macronutrient needs throughout the day. And especially, like, we've worked with fighters in the past, you know, when we're in preseason with athletes and they're training 2-3 times a day. And if you're working in MMA and they might have 3-4 different training sessions because of the different skill sets they work on, you better time the crap out of that because you got to get ready for the next session too. So it's not one of those things where you can really afford to wait to the same degree. I would even argue this when we've worked with wrestlers and they're at tournament time. You know, NCAA tournament, Big Ten, when we were up there, like in between matches, when you got 2-3 matches in a day, you better eat between or you're not going to perform very well in the next one.
Absolutely. The whole protein intake and what your body can use in a single meal, that thing drives me nuts. I've heard some extremely qualified professionals within the collegiate sports setting make those arguments, and I'm just like, what are we doing in regards to continuing education here? Like, we're pretty far past this concept. There was a recent paper I came across. I think the lead author was Park. I know Wolf was on the paper as well,
Okay.
and they were looking at 35 grams of protein compared to 70, and the whole body anabolic response, and they still saw benefits up to 70
Yeah.
grams. And I mean, this paper in particular just does a great job of further dispelling that myth.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's pretty easy to say from a fairly generic response standpoint, if somebody were to say, how much protein should I eat per meal? You're pretty safe saying 20 to 40 grams, right? Within that range, you're probably having some or coming close to some maximizing effect. The question then becomes, so if I eat over 40 grams, it's a waste? What do you mean by waste? Like, because it still goes to other functions. So it depends on when you can fit this in. And I will say this, right? So here's another way of looking at this. If going all the way back to the Schoenfeld and Aragon stuff, right, with the protein timing, and they said overall protein intake in a day matters more than timing. If that's the case, if you have not been able to get your protein intake in, let's say you had 10 grams here, you missed a meal, you did whatever. So by that logic, even if I get 80, 90, 100 grams in at a meal and I meet my daily need, that should still work. If I topped out at 40, then that shouldn't be possible, right? So it comes down to an overall intake. And I would just, I'm still, if you try to trace back where that 20 grams came from, it's in old nutrition textbooks. It's been taught that way for all, but nobody can actually find the reference that actually supports that, especially not in the context of exercise. Realize with who we're talking to on this podcast, you're talking about individuals, we're talking about nutrition with activity, right? Nutrition with exercise. In a general population, and we're looking at just sort of a protein intake aspect and where does it matter, it's going to matter far less than somebody, in terms of timing, than somebody who trains and has an opportunity to take advantage of that anabolic response. So, yeah, again, context becomes really critical here. And I don't mean to use that as a cop-out. And I think sometimes maybe we use the whole "it depends" as a bit of a crutch. But in many ways, it's a fair statement because, you know, if I don't know much about your training or about the other things you're doing for diet or your sleep or anything like that, and somebody says, what should I eat? My response is, it depends. Like, what are you doing, right? So I think sometimes we want this really easy answer, and it's not necessarily a one size fits all. That being said, there are some commonalities that seem to hold sort of across the spectrum when we talk about protein intake, the quality of protein, timing of carbohydrate, the importance of sleep, the role of high intensity training, of consistency, hydration, that's one we can't forget. You start to put all these together, and there's some very generic recommendations we can make that hold very, very well. Outside of that, as you become more experienced, more trained, more guided towards a specific goal, if you're competing, if you're an athlete, whatever it is, those things now start to make a bigger difference at the smaller levels because you're dialing it in, you're trying to optimize, right? And I think what people need to ask themselves, are they interested in sufficient or are they interested in optimal? Because they're not the same thing, all right? And that's where, yeah, it may be sufficient to just eat this amount of protein a day, but is that optimal? And I think that's where the dividing line starts to come in.
For sure. And that's going to be music to the listeners' ears, talking about optimal versus sufficient. Moving through the peri-workout window here,
Yep.
we have a few questions in regard to post-workout nutrition, but let's stop at intra-workout and see what we have to discuss there. Many of our listeners might be going, intra-workout carbohydrate or protein for physique athletes? Like, there's barely any reason to consume carbohydrates pre-workout, but sure, let's hear what you guys have to say about this. With that being said, Dr. Arent, is there a scenario for physique athletes where it might make sense to consume some protein and or carbohydrates intra-workout?
Protein, I'd say less so. Carbohydrate, potentially, depending on the length and intensity of the workout. I'd say at that point, probably your single biggest friend will just simply be staying hydrated, right? So it's water intake more than anything else. It depends on where you're at in your training cycle too, because if you're trying to get ready for a contest, you have to ask yourself, how many of your calories do you want to drink versus how many do you want to eat, right? And so, it really comes down to the nature of your workout, the length of that workout. If it's roughly an hour, might some carbohydrate help? Potentially, right? It's not going to hurt the workout. But again, it depends on your fat loss and weight loss goals and where that fits into your overall caloric intake. In terms of protein intake during, if you ate before, which hopefully you did at some point, even if it's not like an hour before, but you ate before, you're going to have something right after, or within 30, 45 minutes after. Taking in protein during is going to play a pretty minimal role because you're really kind of creating a catabolic environment during that training session, right? You're in breakdown mode because you're trying to mobilize fuels to get your workout together. You're in repair mode after. And so how that fits in. Now, if I'm working with a sport athlete or a runner or a cyclist, where it might be a 1.5, 2 hour training session where we know they've got a high rate of carbohydrate oxidation and stuff like that, yes, carbohydrate fueling during is critical. I still wouldn't worry much about protein. We have with cyclists in the past that I've worked with where we'll, when you're looking at like a 5-6 hour day on the bike or whatever, we'll have some protein feedings in there as well because of what we're trying to do throughout the day and to stave off some of the immune effects as well as, enhance repair and recovery. Carbohydrate's still king in that scenario though. But for most of your, physique trained individuals, if you're looking at bodybuilders, fitness athletes, stuff like that, again, the carb during, it's really going to be reliant on how hard that workout is, how long it is. I would argue if you're looking at, roughly under an hour or whatever, if I'm working with a power lifter and they have these big long breaks, in between most of their sets on the real heavy days, and that might be a 2 hour training session, I still wouldn't be overly worried about the carbohydrate intake. Would it be okay? Sure. It's not going to hurt it, but it's not something where I'd be like, man, if you don't do this, your workout's going to suck, right? So again, understanding the nature of your activity becomes really critical.
If we consider how our nutrition not only affects us in the moment, but down the road, it's actually becoming quite trendy within the community to utilize twice daily training sessions for individuals who might be undergoing this sort of regime. Is there any benefit there for incorporating some sort of intra-workout nutrition?
Potentially, but again, it depends on what it is and it depends on how much time there is between your training sessions, right? So if you were to have like a morning and an afternoon/evening session or whatever, I'd say what you did during down here may be less important. But again, it depends on what you're training for. And if it's purely on the physique side and you're looking at maybe you got your morning cardio and your evening lift or however you split those up, that in part is still going to be, I would argue, now let me say this. What you do during might be more important if you screwed something up during the day, right? So in other words, if you missed a meal, if you didn't take in enough carbohydrate, now supplementing during your workout, especially the evening one, might actually be very useful. But if you ate, you should be okay. And I would say, kind of back to our fasted cardio thing, there's also some really interesting evidence showing that skipping breakfast negatively impacts performance much later in the day. Right. So even from a timing standpoint, think about that one. The timing of what you do early in the day makes a difference later in the day as well.
I recently just saw something in regard to that. it was a real sport. It wasn't in physique athletes, but there's some paper that just came out, and it equated for energy intake, and one group skipped breakfast,
Yep.
and the other, so they had a bigger meal at lunch compared to a group that split those calories up at breakfast and lunch, and they saw that performance was actually still compromised in the evening despite equating for nutrients.
That's exactly right, because you got to think about the catabolic response. And this is why when everybody gets caught up in the whole intermittent fasting and this and that, look, if you're fasting, you are not in an anabolic state. You can't be by definition. So from a fat loss standpoint, now, can you gain muscle doing intermittent fasting? Yeah, you can. But it's probably going to be a little bit harder. But there's a time and a place. But if you're looking to impact body comp, it appears to work, but it's no magic formula. It's typically because you eat less over the course of a day. But what I would argue is, based on what we know about chronobiology in terms of your internal clock, the way most people do intermittent fasting is kind of ass backwards. Because what you'd be better off doing, if that's the case and you're trying to positively influence performance, but also trying to lose body fat, eat earlier, stop eating towards the end of the day. Right? But most people, what they'll do is they think intermittent fasting, I skip breakfast, then I eat until later in the day. Really, with what we know about biology, chronobiology, it should, in most ways, it probably works better the other direction. That being said, there's a lot of work to still be done in that area. And I think it's a little bit muddied because there's about 80 different ways to define intermittent fasting, depending on number of days, whether you're looking at, within day fasting, whether you're looking at alternate day fasting, whether you're looking at, 16/8 in terms of windows and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of different ways to look at that. So I think that's why we have a hard time parsing out the information. But with some of the stuff that's been done on early versus late types of restriction, err on the side of eating early and less late. And I think that, if you want to give it a shot, I would probably try that one first.
I just had Dr. John Hawley on to discuss
Yeah.
this exact concept.
Awesome.
And it is really interesting that it seems to go the other way around, because it seems like, again, there's a lot we need to tease out, but it seems like the ticket is early time restricted feeding. I mean, we looked at that original trial by Sutton. The results
Right.
were really, really good stuff. Finishing up here with post-workout nutrition and carbohydrates, how important they are in this entire nutrient time discussion. You'll see many put forth that, well, getting in carbohydrates immediately post-workout, not really important because carbohydrates haven't been shown to have much of an impact on the MPS response as long as protein is adequate. With that being said, are there some other reasons we should be including carbohydrates in our post-workout meal?
Yeah, so there's some evidence that while they may not enhance the MPS rate, they may impact breakdown, right? So now the protein you're taking in, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, can do its job better, right? Like it goes to more repair. The other thing, too, that can't be dismissed is, well, two things. One, the effect on the immune system, right, which we mentioned earlier. It does have positive effects on immune recovery, right, which is super critical for staying healthy. And then the second thing is the readiness to train again, right? Depending on next session is going to be, it may be under 24 hours, it may be around 24 hours, depends on whether you're going into an off day or whatever it is. And I would say that unless you're purposefully trying to structure your training to do carb restricted training, like I said before, with the work that James E. Morton and them have done, if you're working with an endurance athlete, with the exception of that, there's little to any downside, really none, to eating carbohydrate post. It's just a quantity issue at that point, right? So if you think about, people will be like, I don't eat carbs because I don't want to get fat, right? Well, okay, so carbs don't make you fat. Sorry, that's not the way it works. Fat don't make you fat. Protein don't. Like eating too much is going to make you fat, But when we look at it overall with the carbohydrate stuff, okay. So if you're a little carb phobic, one, I'm sorry for you. But two, let's say you are, well then why not eat it when your body's most primed to use it to store as glycogen rather than fat, which would be post-workout. Right? So if you're going to incorporate it into your meals, there's a reasonable time to do this where you take advantage of it. And again, it's getting ready for the next one. That being said, if you don't eat carbs right away, can I still potentially replenish carbohydrate, replenish glycogen enough to train again the next day? Yes, as long as you get it in at some point. Again, if you can take it in close to, shortly after your training session, you're probably going to get a little bit more out of it. And again, if I'm looking for percentage points, that's important. If If there's bigger parts to an individual's behavior I'm trying to change. I will say this, where I think a lot of people miss the boat on the utility of nutrient timing is the opportunity to teach good habits, because you're actually helping them associate food with performance and recovery, and not just calories are bad, right? And I think we learned that lesson. I would probably say of all the cool stuff we had happen when we were working with Rutgers women's soccer in particular, the ability to work with a female athlete and have them understand that calories are not a bad thing. They help fuel, right? It's just, they're not little evil gremlins. And so, because a lot of them, like, they want to look good too, right? So they're like, and they hear all these fad diets that are out there and whatever. And I remember one of the biggest breakthroughs is because we did heart rate monitoring, training load monitoring and stuff. So we had one of the players come off the field at the end of one of the games, right? And so my doctoral student at the time, she was working with them, and she's got her iPad out, and so it's got like what their caloric output was, their distance traveled and stuff. And the player looks over her shoulder and goes, "I got to eat a lot tonight." Like, she actually associated, I need to feed, right? Because she saw, man, I expended 1,800 calories in this match. I've got a lot of work to do to feed. So I think by emphasizing the role that post-workout nutrition plays, you have an opportunity to instill good habits. And I will say, sort of working with college athletes, they finish training. Many of them now have to go off to class, or they got other stuff going on. If they don't eat right away after training, it may be hours before they actually do eat, just because they don't plan ahead. So if we had something right at the field, if they were marching off and we're drinking a recovery shake or whatever, at least I know they're getting something then until they can eat again, versus this prolonged fast afterwards where they haven't started the repair process and now I'm screwed for the next day. So I think that if we look at it as a unique opportunity to teach people about the role of nutrition and how to pay attention to it and understanding what the body's trying to do, I don't see the problem with that.
Fantastic. On the Muscle Memoirs, we're all about percentage points here. We discussed some of the uniqueness of the anabolic window, your meal immediately post-exercise. Considering these factors, I'll throw a theoretical situation at you. If we have 2 meals post-workout and we have 200 grams of carbs left for the day, could we argue that there's something to be gained by, rather than just splitting those up 100 and 100, that we should be doing something more like 150 post and then 50 in the meal following, in regard to body composition outcomes?
I would say that's a fair assessment. I'm not even sure you'd have to make it that extreme. It could be like 120 and then 80. In terms of what you're looking for. But yeah, if you're sort of tracking your macros and you're trying to fit this in that window, I'm not a huge fan of that, but I know for some people it does provide accountability and it will certainly help them. There's nothing magical about it, but I think that of that, let's put it in this scenario. If of that 200 grams of carbohydrate, you're talking about some of the high energy carbohydrate, stuff that's more rapidly absorbed, that's more dense in terms of calories, the things we think of as more like a high glycemic idea. Not a big fan of the glycemic stuff, but that's okay. So I tend to talk to them as high energy and low energy, right? So if you're looking at that, err on the side of putting more of your high energy and that closer to the workout time. And then your lower energy carbs can come at the other time in terms of how you balance those out as well. So even how you separate out the carbohydrate type might be another way to manipulate that as well.
Awesome. Moving to our last meal of the day, in the context of pre-sleep protein,
Yep.
I think it's pretty clear that there's no downside to having a casein protein source in your last meal of the day. There's probably only upside to doing this. But considering this extended period without access to nutrients while we're sleeping, can we make the case that it's important to consume a larger than usual bolus of protein, or does it not really matter as long as our total daily intake's in check?
You look, if you're at that point in your day and you haven't met your daily protein intake, then a larger bolus may be incredibly well founded at that point, because that might be where you get the rest of it in and it helps you during the recovery. How big that bolus has to be, honestly, if you look at from a protein pacing standpoint, some of the work Paul Arciero has done, just an evenly spaced and quantity throughout will be fine, right? And that includes the sleep. I've heard Stu Phillips postulate on the idea that perhaps that pre-bed one could be your bigger protein feeding if you have not hit that throughout the day. Wouldn't disagree with that either. I think it just depends on what you have left to fill, but I don't think it has to be bigger. And oh, by the way, there's some evidence that it may not have to be casein, because actually even whey behaves differently when you're going to sleep because of what happens to the digestive and absorptive process. So it depends on what you tolerate well. I think for some people, the only downside to the protein intake pre-bed just depends on how you sleep if you feel full. So you might not want a protein that makes, like, you might not want this big protein fluffy shake, right, that makes you feel incredibly full going to bed. But, in the form of cottage cheese, some of the yogurt products, a casein protein, or a whey, or some mixed, I would probably even say mixed protein. Hey, there's an idea, right? Does it have to just be one source? As we look at the protein matrix, I think any of that is a good idea. And you're right, from a repair standpoint and stuff like that. Look, bodybuilders for years have been notorious, especially like pro bodybuilders, that get up in the middle of the night, slam a protein shake, go back to bed. The downside of that is you're disrupting your sleep-wake cycle, right? So there's now a negative impact when it comes to growth hormone and stuff like that, and even cortisol. So yeah, the protein feeding before bed, and I think that Mike Ormsby's done good work on this. There's been tremendous work that's come out of Europe on this from multiple labs, and so again, I think that there is definitely a value in that. But to me, there's just another aspect of nutrient timing. It goes beyond just pre and post workout. We've talked about breakfast. We've talked about what you do during your workout, the pre and the post, as well as sleep, right? So timing kind of occurs throughout the day. It's a hard thing to avoid unless you're just eating one big ass meal.
Very interesting. Overall, when it comes to nutrient timing, we've outlined that, this is the icing on the cake, but it's still worthwhile. It's pretty much never a bad idea to pay a little little more attention to your nutrient timing throughout the day. If we look at the advanced athlete compared to the novice, would you say that there's any difference in regard to how much they have to gain from nutrient timing? Should one be focusing more on this than the other?
Yeah, I think the more advanced you become, potentially the more impactful the timing aspect becomes if you've kind of ironed out all the other pieces. With a novice, I mean, think about it like when you first started lifting, right? You can do pretty much anything and you're going to have an impact, right? You're going to get stronger, you're going to grow, whatever. It's a question of how long can you keep that up. Same thing when you're manipulating protein intake or overall dietary intake. In a novice, the big movers will kind of overshadow everything else. It doesn't mean that timing didn't matter. It's just that it kind of gets buried in everything else, right? So it's not the first thing. Now, I would argue from a healthy habits or a teaching good habits, because good habits are as hard to break as bad habits, why not start understanding timing of meals and how this impacts your overall health and function and stuff? But again, I don't know that that's going to be the big needle mover when it comes to impacting performance or hypertrophy. There's much bigger things at stake. As you become more advanced and you're looking for that 1 to 5% here and there, timing can start to make a much bigger difference, right? And so even when I've worked with youth athletes to high school to college to pro to Olympic caliber, as we get farther up in that food chain, timing and other smaller nuanced aspects are things we start to think about, right? Where can we think about this, right? So in the 2016 Summer Games, the difference between the gold and the silver in the marathon was 1%. So if you improve 1.2%, you potentially just won the gold, right? So the little things start to matter, but it's going to be more obvious for the payoff at the high end. When you're just starting out, just do the basics well. Just do the basics well. If you're not sleeping enough and you're deficient or you're eating a bunch of crap in your diet, you're not really paying attention to any food quality issues, you miss meals, you're skipping training, man, I can talk about timing till I'm blue in the face. It's not going to change all this. But if you're taking care of the train hard, be consistent, be realistic, eat with purpose, right? Try to understand what you're trying to accomplish. And when you start to put all this together, now we can start to add in the other little things, but not before that. It's not my first point of emphasis. It's not that it's not important. It's just not the most important aspect. So if I have an opportunity early on to integrate that so that people learn those habits early, fantastic. But don't expect that that's the thing that's making all the difference. It's the big pieces of that cake that are making it, then I start to layer with the icing. Because let's face it, the icing is what makes it taste really good, right? So, that's where we want to start adding that stuff in.
Excellent. I think that was a perfect way to sum up our conversation today, Dr. Arent. I absolutely love this discussion. I know the listeners are going to thoroughly enjoy it as well.
Thanks, Mike.
For those who want to learn more about you, support you, where can we point them toward?
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you can find all those. Pretty easy to find at the University of South Carolina, but Instagram and Twitter are both at Shawn Arent, ShawnArent. Do my best to try to engage with everybody, so happy to answer questions, and I don't know. I post a lot of good dog pictures too.
Great. And those links will be in the show notes, but that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.